I was sentenced without ceremony, without a gavel or a raised voice, in a chamber that smelled of dust, ink, and old incense. It was not a courtroom, though it had once been, before the benches were removed to make space for filing cabinets that rose like mausoleums along the walls. The lumen globes flickered overhead, never fully bright, as if even the light had learned restraint. I stood on a marked square of cracked stone, while a clerk sat behind a lectern piled high with parchment. I remember the sound of pages turning more clearly than I remember the man himself. He spoke my name once, mispronounced it, then crossed it out with a heavy stylus. The scratch of that line through ink felt louder than any shout. In its place, he stamped a designation, letters and numbers meaningless to me, but heavy with finality. The seal came down hard, wax cracking as it cooled. That sound marked the end of whatever I had been before. There was no accusation, no defense, only a brief recital of need. Quotas had fallen behind. Labor reserves were depleted. Reassignment was mandatory. I was thanked for my service in advance. 2 enforcers took me by the arms, their gauntlets cold and impersonal. They did not tighten their grip, because there was no need. The process moved me along like a current, and I found myself carried with it. We passed through corridors that grew narrower and dirtier the deeper we went, the stone giving way to rusted metal and sweating pipes. I smelled boiled nutrients long before I saw the vats, a thick, cloying odor that settled in the back of my throat. Disinfectant fought it constantly, sharp and chemical, but never won. The gates of the processing complex loomed ahead, massive slabs of metal engraved with devotional script and production mottos. West is heresy, one rid. Compliance is life, said another. Servo skulls hovered near the entrance, their optics glowing as they scanned us, recording intake. I was one among dozens, all marked with fresh seals on our papers, all silent. Some wept quietly, others stared straight ahead. I did neither. I felt emptied already, as if the clerk's stylus had scraped something out of me along with my name. Inside, the induction hall was a cathedral of industry. Chains clattered overhead, carrying loads I could not yet bring myself to identify. The floor was slick, scrubbed clean so often that the metal beneath showed through in places, polished by countless boots. An overseer stood on a raised platform, robed and augmetic-eyed, his voice amplified through crackling speakers. He welcomed us in the language of sermons, blessing our arrival and reminding us of the honor bestowed upon us. Every rule was phrased as a prayer. Every warning came wrapped in gratitude. We were told when to breathe, when to eat, when to speak, though speaking was discouraged. We were instructed in the proper posture of labor, the approved angle of the spine, the sanctioned grip of the hands. Deviations were sins. Injuries were failures of faith. Survival was never mentioned as a goal. Instead, they spoke of output, of contribution, of being part of something vast and eternal. I understood, listening to the litany, that my continued existence was incidental at best. They issued us uniforms that smelled of lye and old sweat, stiff with repeated sterilization. Mine hung loosely, marked with my designation stenciled in faded paint. I was given a token, a thin strip of metal punched with holes that would be read by machines to log my hours. The overseer explained that loss of the token would be recorded as dereliction. Loss of a limb would be recorded as acceptable variance. Loss of life would be recorded as resource recovery. We were marched again, deeper into the complex, past shrines bolted to the walls where workers knelt briefly as we passed. I caught glimpses of faces like my own, hollow-eyed, skin sallow, lips moving in constant, murmured prayer. The air grew warmer, wetter, steam hissed from vents, carrying with it the smell of fat and protein. Somewhere nearby, machinery roared, a constant, hungry sound that vibrated through my bones. At a junction marked by hazard stripes and purity seals, we were separated into groups. My group was led down a ramp that sloped gently but endlessly downward. With each step, the weight of the place pressed harder on my chest. I tried to remember my life before this, the taste of real food, the sound of laughter, but the memories slipped away, blurred by the drone of recited doctrine piped through hidden speakers. To serve is to live, the voice intuned. To be used is to be blessed. At the end of the ramp, we were ordered to kneel. A junior clerk moved along the line, scanning our tokens and applying additional stamps to our papers. When he reached me, He paused just long enough to adjust his auspex, then nodded. "Rendering floor assignment," he said, as if commenting on the weather. I did not know what that meant yet, but something in his tone told me it was final. They gave us our first ration there, a grey slab wrapped in waxed paper. I chewed it mechanically, tasting nothing, my mouth already numb. The floor beneath my knees was cold, and I realized with a distant sort of curiosity that it was sloped toward a drain. A thin trickle of reddish water ran past, carrying scraps I did not want to examine too closely. Above us, the machines roared on, indifferent and eternal. That was when understanding settled fully upon me, heavy and inescapable. This place did not care if I endured. It did not care if I broke. All that mattered was that I was here, that my designation was logged, that my body would be applied to the quota until it failed. Compliance was not a path to survival. It was the purpose itself. As I bowed my head and repeated the words they had taught us, I felt the last resistance drain away. I was inducted not into a job, but into a process that would grind me down, measure by measure, until nothing remained unaccounted for. My first shift began before the lumen strips warmed, though before is an indulgent word in a place that does not truly sleep. The complex had its own rhythm, geared, timed, indifferent, like a clock that had forgotten what it was meant to measure. Somewhere above, sirens moaned the changeover, a long mournful note that echoed through the pipes and settled into my teeth. The dormitory block disgorged us in silence. We filed out in rows, each of us clutching our tokens like prayer beads, stepping over the same riveted plates and puddles we had stepped over the night prior. The air was colder in the corridors, stale with recycled breath and machine oil. It warmed as we descended, warmed until it became wet. A heavy heat that carried the sweet, sour taint of boiled protein. We arrived at the rendering floor through a set of double doors, sealed with wax and stamped parchment. A worker in a stained robe cut the seal with a hook blade as if performing a rite. The doors swung open, and the sound hit me first, a constant metallic shriek. A chorus of engines and grinding teeth, the sort of noise that made language feel pointless. The second thing was the smell. I had thought I understood it from the corridors, nutrients and disinfectant, but here it was concentrated, alive. Hot fat, scorched hair, chemical bleach, rust, and something underlying it all like a confession whispered into your ear, the unmistakable musk of human flesh reduced to inventory. We were issued earplugs at the threshold, tiny wax cones stamped with a purity mark. A gift. The overseer barked through his Vox amplifier. To protect your hearing for extended service. I rolled mine between my fingers, feeling the grit of cheap wax, and pressed them in. The noise softened slightly, but it never ceased. It still vibrated in my ribcage. It still made my stomach tighten. An overseer awaited us on a walkway above the floor, his robe pristine compared to ours, his face hidden behind a metal respirator that exhaled in steady, contemptuous sighs. He carried a data slate, and his augmetic eye clicked as it scanned us. "New allocations," he announced. "You will be slotted into function. You will not deviate. You will not pause. You will not speak unless addressed. If you pray, pray silently. The machine's spirits do not require your noise." Below him the floor stretched out like a battlefield of industry, conveyor belts running in parallel rows, each belt carrying shapes under tarps, into chutes, toward the mouth of grinders the size of shrines. The grinders themselves were armored in riveted casings, their hatches covered in warning sigils. Steam rose from vents along their sides, and the air around them shimmered with heat. Workers moved with practiced speed, tossing, dragging, pushing, their boots slipping slightly on the slick metal. Every few steps, a drain interrupted the flooring, and the liquid running toward it was never clear. The overseer assigned me to intake line 7. I remember the number, because it was painted above the belt in flaking white, the digits crooked as if they had been repainted too many times. A veteran worker took my arm and pulled me down the steps onto the floor. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin gray, and his hair was shaved close to the scalp. He did not offer his name. He did not ask mine. He only pointed and spoke in short, clipped commands, like a man teaching a child how to avoid being crushed. "Stand here," he said, positioning me beside the belt. "Feet wide. Keep your hands clear of the rollers. Grip the ankles. Two-handed. Throw into the chute. Don't look at their faces. I wanted to laugh at that last instruction, the absurd mercy of it, but I couldn't. The belt delivered the first body to me within seconds, no pause, no easing in. It slid forward under a tarp, the fabric soaked through in places, clinging to whatever lay beneath. The tarp snagged on the lip of the belt and tore, exposing pale skin. For a heartbeat I froze, not because I did not understand what I was meant to do, but because my mind still insisted on calling it a person. The veteran worker shoved my shoulder hard. Move, he said. Quota doesn't care. I reached for the ankles. They were cold, stiff, the skin waxy under my gloves. The body was heavier than I expected, not because of mass alone but because of meaning, because my arms remembered holding living weight once, helping someone up, carrying a child, dragging a friend away from danger. This was not that. This was inventory. I pulled, and the body slid toward the chute, the tarp scraping over the belt like a shroud being dragged. The chute's mouth yawned open, dark metal lined with teeth marks from 1,000 prior loads. A chain mechanism above it lowered a rusted hook that snagged the body's uniform and jerked it forward. The grinder beyond roared, and for a moment I saw nothing but darkness and the sheen of oil on steel. Then the body disappeared, swallowed whole, and the machine's pitch changed as it bit down. The sound was not a clean crunch. It was wet. It was an intimate tearing noise that rose through the floor and into my knees. I swallowed bile. The wax earplugs did nothing for the feeling of it. I forced my hands back to the belt as the next tarp arrived. Time became a smear. The belt never stopped. Bodies arrived in steady succession, some wrapped fully, some partially exposed, some so damaged they were hardly recognizable. I tried to obey the veteran's warning, tried to keep my eyes on hands and ankles, on grips and throws, but details slipped through anyway. A tattoo on a forearm, an old devotional mark, a piece of jewelry still caught on a finger, a boot with a child's name scratched into the leather. Each one was a pinprick, a reminder that these had once walked, spoken, feared. The more I tried to ignore it, the more my mind insisted on noticing. At one point a body came down the belt wearing part of a uniform, ragged cloth, a shattered chest plate. Something metallic clinked against the belt beside it, a small token, a stamped strip like mine. My hands hesitated, fingers hovering. The veteran saw it and slapped my wrist. "Leave it," he mouthed, his words barely audible. "Personal effects are processed later. Don't slow the line. Slow the line." As if the line were a living thing that could be offended. As if the belt might punish me for the sin of remembrance. Overseers moved along the floor at intervals, their boots cleaner than ours, their data slates recording the steady tally of input. When someone faltered even for a second, a shock prod corrected them. I saw it happen to a woman 2 stations down, her hands trembling as she tried to lift a particularly heavy corpse. She slipped, the body's head striking the side of the chute with a dull thud. She froze, horrified at the waste of time, at the sound, at the indignity. An overseer appeared as if summoned by her hesitation and drove the prod into her shoulder. She screamed, one raw, brief sound, before biting it off, eyes wide with terror. The overseer didn't even look at her face. He only pointed at the belt and barked, "Continue." The belt did not care that she had screamed. The belt did not slow. Hours passed, though I only know that because the shift chimes rang at intervals, and the prayers over the speakers changed in tone. My arms began to burn, my shoulders stiffening. Sweat ran down my back, trapped under the uniform, soaking the cloth until it clung to me like a second skin. The floor was slicker now, the drains overwhelmed. My boots slipped slightly each time I shifted my weight. Every time I reached for an ankle, I felt the faint tremor in my hands grow worse. At some point my gloves tore at the fingertips. I noticed only when I felt skin-to-skin contact, cold flesh against my own. The sensation made me flinch. The veteran worker noticed and tossed me another pair without breaking rhythm, the act almost gentle in its efficiency. "Don't bleed into the line," he said, his voice flat. "They'll charge you for contamination." Charge me. Even my blood had a value, a bureaucratic consequence. The grinders screamed louder as the day progressed, their casings vibrating, their machine spirits hungry. Sometimes the pitch shifted abruptly, and we all learned to tense, ready for a jam. A jam meant lost time meant punishment. When it happened once, near the end, an intake chute clogged with bone and fabric, the belt backed up, bodies accumulating, tarps tangling. For a brief, terrifying moment, the line actually slowed. The overseers descended on us instantly. A maintenance servitor lumbered in, its hands replaced with tools, its face a blank plate with a single red optic. It jammed its arm into the chute and tore out the blockage in wet, efficient motions. The whole time, the overseers shouted prayers and threats, swinging shock prods, barking at us to hold the bodies, to keep them from spilling, to maintain order. My hands were slick with sweat and grime. I gripped ankles and wrists and dragged, feeling the weight of bodies pile against my shins. The smell intensified in the congestion, hot flesh trapped too long, fat steaming in the heat. My stomach lurched. When the jam cleared, the grinder's roar surged back to full strength like a beast inhaling. The belt resumed its merciless pace. No one congratulated us. No one thanked us. The overseers simply returned to their walkways, recording the incident as a variance and adding it to our files. By the time the end of shift siren howled, I could no longer feel my hands properly. My arms moved like borrowed limbs, responding a second after my mind commanded them. I had thrown so many bodies into the chute that the action had become a reflex, a prayer in motion. Toss. Reach. Grip, pull. Toss. My muscles trembled with exhaustion, but the belt did not care. The belt would have continued forever if the shift had not ended by schedule. We were dismissed in orderly lines, tokens scanned, output logged. A clerk stood by the exit with a data slate, confirming our continued allocation. As I passed, he nodded without looking at me. Function sustained, he murmured, as if describing a machine part that had not yet failed. In the dormitory block, the air was colder again, but I could still smell the rendering floor on myself. It had soaked into my hair, my pores, my tongue. The communal wash stations offered harsh soap and freezing water. I scrubbed until my skin stung, but the scent remained, clinging to me like guilt. Around me, others washed in silence, their faces blank. No one spoke of what we had done. No one needed to. When the ration bell rang, I took my grey slab and sat on my bunk. I raised it to my mouth, expecting hunger, expecting relief. Instead, the first bite tasted like ash. It crumbled dryly between my teeth, leaving a bitter film. My stomach turned, but I swallowed anyway because hunger was mandatory too. That night, when I lay down, the dormitory lights never fully dimmed. The lumen strips flickered weakly, casting shadows that crawled along the ceiling. I closed my eyes and heard the grenders still, their scream embedded in my skull. Behind my eyelids, the belt kept moving. The tarps kept tearing. The bodies kept sliding forward. My hands twitched in the air as if still gripping ankles, still obeying the line. Even in rest, I could not stop working. I realized then that the first shift had not ended at the siren. It had only changed location. The complex had taken my hours, my strength, my senses, and it had left me with one gift, the certainty that tomorrow the belt would be waiting, and I would return to it. Because compliance was the only thing I had left to offer. They told us cleanliness was holiness, and holiness was survival. The phrase was painted in flaking letters above the wash hall doors, half obscured by steam and mildew. I repeated it silently as I shuffled in with the others after the second cycle, my muscles aching in a deep, grinding way that no rest seemed to touch. The rendering floor still clung to me, not just as a smell but as a presence, like something oily wrapped around my spine. The wash hall was meant to strip that away. It never did. The hall itself was long and low-ceilinged, its walls tiled in off, white ceramic cracked by decades of heat and cold. Rows of cleansing alcoves lined either side, each one fitted with a pipe that spat water at irregular pressure and a dispenser for caustic soap. Above us, picked eyes followed our movements, their lenses clicking softly as they tracked posture, duration, and compliance. A robed purity attendant stood at the far end, clutching a censer that released coils of incense smoke, the scent sharp and medicinal. He chanted as we washed, a droning litany about the sanctity of labor and the danger of spiritual contamination. I stripped mechanically, hanging my stiff uniform on a numbered hook. My skin beneath was blotched and raw, marked with bruises I did not remember earning. When the water hit me, it was ice cold, shocking enough to force a gasp from my chest. The attendant snapped his gaze toward me at the sound, and I bit it back immediately, lips pressed tight. Audible discomfort was frowned upon. Pain was acceptable. Expression was not. The soap burned. It was designed that way, I learned. A chemical agent meant to scar away not just physical residue but lingering impurities of thought. I worked it into my hair, my armpits, the creases of my elbows, scrubbing until my nails scraped skin. The smell of disinfectant rose in choking waves, mixing with the incense until my eyes watered. Around me, others did the same, faces blank, jaws clenched, no one rushed. The picked eyes recorded time spent per limb, per region. Too fast was suspicious. Too slow was indulgent, as I scrubbed. I tried not to think about why this ritual mattered so much. The sermons told us that the dead we processed were sanctified by their final service, but also dangerous, vessels of corruption if handled improperly. We were taught that residue could seep into us, taint our thoughts, weaken our devotion. The solution, according to the purity manuals, was repetition: wash, chant, scrub, repeat until doubt wore thin. After the water came the inspection. We lined up naked on cold stone, arms raised, while a junior clerk walked the row with an auspex wand. It hummed softly as it passed over skin, scanning for contaminants, infections, unauthorized augmentations. When it lingered too long on one worker's chest, a red rune flared. The clerk frowned and made a note on his slate. 2 enforcers appeared from nowhere and dragged the man away, his feet skidding on the wet floor. He did not scream. He did not ask why. He only stared straight ahead as he vanished through a side door marked with a hazard sigil. The line closed ranks behind him without comment. I passed inspection. The wand hummed, flickered, moved on. Relief was not something I allowed myself to feel. Passing only meant postponement. We dressed again and filed into the adjoining chapel, a narrow space wedged between the wash hall and the dormitory. The air here was warmer, heavy with candle smoke and the metallic tang of blood offerings. We knelt on grated flooring while a Vox speaker crackled to life overhead. A recorded sermon began to play, its voice distorted by age and static. It spoke of duty as a cleansing fire, of labor as penance, of how the emperor, unnamed but ever present, saw all service as equal in his ledger. As I knelt, my knees aching against the metal, my thoughts drifted despite myself. Images from the line surfaced unbidden: the tattooed forearm, the child's name scratched into leather, the cold weight of ankles in my hands. Each memory felt like a stain I had failed to scrub away. I clenched my jaw and tried to focus on the words being spoken, to let them overwrite my own thoughts. To endure is to be pure, the voice intoned. To question is to invite decay. Decay. The word followed me back to the dormitory, echoing in my skull. That night, sleep came in fragments. When I closed my eyes, I dreamed of measurements, numbers scrolling endlessly, weights and temperatures, and acceptable margins of waste. I dreamed of my hands on a scale, my worth fluctuating with each gram. I woke with my heart racing, my mouth dry, the taste of disinfectant still lingering on my tongue. The next cycle began the same way. Siren, march, grend, wash, pray. Somewhere in that repetition, something inside me shifted. The horror did not vanish, but it dulled, like a blade worn down through constant use. I found myself thinking less about faces and more about efficiency, how to grip better, how to throw faster, how to avoid the shock prod's attention. When an overseer nodded at my station, approvingly, a small, traitorous spark of pride flared in my chest. I hated myself for it, but it burned anyway. The purity rituals intensified as the days blurred together. New chants were introduced, longer and more complex, meant to occupy the mind fully. We were taught to recite them internally while working, syncing our movements to the rhythm of the words. Reach on the first phrase. Pull on the second. Toss on the third. It worked. The line flowed smoother. Incidents decreased. The overseers recorded improved metrics and commended our devotion in clip. Official language. Anyone who faltered was corrected. Sometimes gently, with extra prayers assigned. Sometimes harshly, with reduced rations or additional shifts. I saw a woman collapse during washing, her legs giving out as the cold water hit her. The attendant prodded her with his censer until she forced herself upright again, teeth chattering, eyes unfocused. Cleanliness is mercy, he reminded her, voice flat. She nodded weakly and resumed scrubbing. I began to scrub harder than necessary. Even when my skin cracked and bled, pain became proof to the picked eyes, to the attendants, to myself, that I was still trying. The blood washed away quickly, diluted and carried off toward the drains. I wondered, distantly, if it was logged somewhere, if my contribution was noted even in that small way. My prayers changed. At first I had asked for strength, for endurance, for the ability to keep going. Those felt childish now, selfish. Instead, I prayed for numbness, for the dulling of memory, for the erasure of the small, stubborn part of me that still recoiled when skin touched skin on the line. I asked to become efficient, nothing more. One evening, as I knelt in the chapel, repeating the litany for the 100th time, I realized I could no longer remember my name at all, not even the sound of it. The designation on my uniform felt more real, more immediate. It was what the machines read. It was what the overseers spoke. It was what the ledger recognized. The loss did not hurt as much as I thought it would. It felt tidy, like a stain finally scrubbed away. When the sermon ended, we rose as one, joints creaking, and filed back toward the dormitory. The picked eyes followed us, satisfied. The incense burned low, its smoke thinning. As I lay on my bunk, staring up at the flickering lumen strips, I recited the chant silently over and over, until the words lost meaning and became sound. In that sound, I found a fragile peace, not salvation, not hope, but a kind of quiet. If my soul could be sanitized, perhaps the rest would be easier to endure. The incident happened without drama, which somehow made it worse. There was no alarm, no shouted warning, no moment where time slowed to grant me the dignity of anticipation. The belt kept moving, the grinder kept screaming, and my hands kept working until suddenly they didn't, until pain arrived not as a spike, but as an absence, a hollow where sensation should have been. I had reached for the next body on intake line 7, fingers closing around an ankle slick with condensation and fat. The belt juddered, just slightly, a mechanical hiccup that would later be logged as routine variance. My grip slipped. Instinct made me grab again, faster, sloppier. My right hand slid too close to the rollers. There was a sound, short, wet, final. Not loud enough to cut through the grinder's roar, but intimate enough that I felt it in my teeth. Pressure clamped down, crushing rather than slicing. For a fraction of a second, my mind refused to understand what my eyes were seeing. My glove trapped, the fabric darkening rapidly, the machine indifferent to my panic. I screamed. I broke protocol. The sound tore out of me before prayer or discipline could stop it. The veteran worker beside me reacted instantly, slamming the emergency lever with his shoulder. The belt shuddered to a halt, bodies piling awkwardly behind us. The grinder's pitch dropped to a sulky growl. Overseers descended within seconds, shock prods already raised, their augmented eyes assessing damage not to me, but to the line. They pried my hand free with a metal bar. 2 fingers, index and middle, remained behind, crushed into something no longer recognizable as flesh. The pain arrived all at once then, white hot and total, racing up my arm and into my skull. I retched, barely missing the belt. An overseer struck me across the face with the prod, not to punish, but to keep me conscious. "Contain the spill," one of them ordered. Another wrapped my bleeding hand in a strip torn from my own uniform, knotting it tight enough to make my vision dim. I was dragged away as the servitors moved in, clearing the jam, restarting the belt. Within moments, intake line 7 was operational again. My absence registered only as a brief dip in efficiency. They took me not to a chapel, not to a tribunal, but to a medici annex bolted onto the side of the complex like an afterthought. The air inside was colder, sterile in a way the wash halls never were. It smelled of antiseptic and burned metal. A medica functionary waited there, his lower body replaced entirely by a tracked chassis, his hands a mismatched pair of surgical tools. He did not ask how I felt. He did not apologize. Reclassification pending, he intoned, scanning my wound. Flesh loss acceptable. Tool compatibility reduced. They anesthetized me partially, enough to dull the edge, not enough to grant relief. I watched as they cleaned the stump, as they removed what remained of the fingers with efficient, practiced motions. I smelled my own cauterized flesh and thought distantly of the grinders, of how similar the scent was. When the augmetic was fitted, a crude, 2-pronged clamp designed for gripping rather than finesse, I bit through my lip to keep from crying out again. Blood ran down my chin, warm and metallic. Imperial property restored to function, the medica said, sealing the connection with a hiss of steam. He tested the augmetic's movement, opening and closing it like a tool on a workbench. The sensation was wrong, pressure without touch, motion without feeling. I nodded when he told me to, because nodding was easier than thinking. There was no recovery period, no rest. A clerk arrived before the medica even finished logging the procedure, data slate already in hand. Rendering floor no longer optimal, he announced. Reassignment approved. VAT, adjacent duties. That was how my reclassification was decided. Not as punishment, not as mercy, but as optimization. My new station was closer to the vats, where the output of the grinders was processed further, boiled down, stabilized and packaged. The air there was thick and wet, heavy with steam that coated everything in a greasy film. The noise was different too, less screaming metal, more constant churning and bubbling, like 1,000 stomachs digesting in unison. The floors were perpetually damp, the drains clogged with residue that never quite washed away. I worked with my augmetic hand awkwardly at first, relearning grips, adjusting my stance. Supervisors watched closely, noting delays, recalculating my expected output. I was slower now, less precise. The data slates reflected that immediately. I felt it like a weight pressing down on my chest. Coworkers disappeared here more quietly than on the intake lines. There were no dramatic incidents, no jams to draw attention. Instead, someone would simply fail to report for shift. Their station would be empty, then filled by the next cycle. The overseers never explained. They didn't have to. Improved efficiency statistics appeared on the notice boards shortly after each absence, numbers climbing as bodies vanished. I learned to keep my head down and my mouth shut. I spoke only when spoken to, and even then as little as possible. I learned the sound of disciplinary corridors opening, the hiss of sealed doors, the faint echo of footsteps that did not return. Each time I heard it, my augmetic hand twitched involuntarily, its metal prongs clacking softly. At night, infection set into the stump despite the medica's assurances. The flesh around the augmetic connection grew hot and swollen, weeping thin, foul-smelling fluid. I reported it once, as protocol demanded. The response was a notation and a warning about productivity impact. I stopped reporting after that, wrapping the wound tighter, swallowing the pain along with my rations. Something in my thoughts began to curdle during those weeks. The chants still played. The prayers were still recited, but they no longer soothed. They felt thin, stretched over a reality too heavy to contain. I found myself watching the vats with a detached fascination, imagining how easily a body could slip in unnoticed, how efficiently it would be processed. The thought did not frighten me. It felt logical. One cycle. I caught my reflection in the polished side of a vat, my face thinner, eyes sunken, one hand flesh and scar, the other metal and clamp. For a moment, I did not recognize myself at all. Then the overseer's shadow fell over me, and the moment passed. Back to task, he said not unkindly. I obeyed. Of course I did. Reclassification had not spared me. It had simply moved me closer to the end, nearer the place where all output eventually converged. I could feel it in the heat, in the damp air that filled my lungs, in the way the vats seemed to breathe around me. The Imperium had adjusted my role, nothing more. I was still useful, still counted, and as long as that was true, I would remain here, working, rotting, waiting for the ledger to decide otherwise. The alarms did not scream when they should have. That was the first failure, the one that would later be dissected and catalogued in triplicate. A minor delay in the Auspex readings, a lag in the purity sensors, nothing dramatic. Nothing that would have drawn attention in a place where machines groaned and malfunctioned as part of their daily liturgy. By the time the klaxons finally wailed, long and accusatory, the damage had already been done. I was vat adjacent when it happened, monitoring the flow gauges with my good hand while the augmetic clamp steadied a hose swollen with heat and pressure. Steam curled around my head, carrying the familiar wet stink of rendered matter. The numbers on the gauge flickered, dipping briefly below the approved margin before correcting themselves. I noticed it. I hesitated. That moment, barely a heartbeat long, would replay itself in my mind for cycles afterward. Then the alarm sounded. Red lumen strips flared along the ceiling, bathing the chamber in the color of exposed flesh. The churning of the vats slowed, then ceased entirely, leaving an unnatural silence broken only by the hiss of escaping steam. Workers froze mid-motion, eyes darting, breaths held. We all knew what the alarm meant: spoilage, heresy of process. Hands away from equipment. A voice boomed through the Vox system. Remain at your stations. Await inspection. The bulkhead doors slammed shut with a final echoing clang. Purity seals hissed as they fused, locking us inside. I felt my stomach drop, a cold weight settling beneath my ribs. Being sealed in meant one thing: collective guilt. The Imperium did not waste time searching for individuals when proximity was more efficient. We waited. Minutes stretched into something shapeless and suffocating. The air grew hotter without the vats running, humidity clinging to skin and lungs. No one spoke. Even breathing felt too loud. I stared at the gauge in front of me, watching the needle tremble slightly, as if it too were afraid. When the purity auditors arrived, we felt them before we saw them. The temperature dropped abruptly as their escort vented cold air into the chamber, pushing back the steam. The bulkhead doors opened just wide enough to admit them, then sealed again behind. They wore sealed armor and hooded helms, their forms angular and severe, robes marked with layered sigils of authority. Their boots did not slip on the wet floor. Their presence alone seemed to impose order on the chaos. They did not introduce themselves. They did not explain the nature of the contamination. One of them raised a device that emitted a low, thrumming hum as it swept the chamber. The sound made my teeth ache. Another auditor consulted a data slate, its screen reflecting red light onto his visor. Overseers stood back, silent and rigid, suddenly deferential in a way I had never seen before. Line deviation confirmed, one auditor announced. His voice was filtered, emotionless. Spoiled matter entered stabilization phase. Output compromised. A murmur rippled through the workers, despite our efforts to remain silent. It was quickly crushed by a sharp gesture from an enforcer, shock prod crackling threateningly. The auditor's helm turned slowly, scanning us as if we were specimens laid out for examination. Proximity assigns culpability, he continued. Interrogation will proceed. They started with the nearest station. A man 2 positions down from me was singled out, his designation barked out over the Vox. He stepped forward trembling, his hands raised as instructed. The questions were short and precise. Had he noticed any irregularity? Had he deviated from protocol? Had he hesitated? His answers came out rushed and incoherent, fear tangling his words. The auditor listened without comment, then nodded once. Confession inadequate, he said. Punitive correction authorized. The enforcers took the man by the arms and dragged him toward a side hatch I had never noticed before. It opened onto darkness. The hatch closed. We did not hear what happened next, but the data slate chimed softly as a notation was added. They moved on, station by station, question, answer, judgment. When they reached me, my throat felt dry as dust. I stepped forward, augmetic hand clacking softly with the motion. The auditor's gaze lingered on it for a fraction of a second longer than necessary. Report, he commanded. I told the truth, because the truth felt safest, because lies were inefficient. I said I had noticed a brief fluctuation in the gauge. I said it corrected itself. I said I did not halt the process because the margin returned to acceptable range. As I spoke, I realized how damning it sounded. Awareness without action, hesitation logged but unaddressed. The auditor nodded again. Deviation acknowledged, he said. Responsibility accepted. The question was a formality. I answered yes. A data slate was thrust into my good hand. The screen displayed a confession already written, dense with legal script and doctrinal phrasing. I recognized none of the words as my own, but they bore my designation in 3 places, each line awaiting confirmation. My thumb hovered over the reader. It shook. I pressed it down. The slate chimed. Confession logged. The auditor said. Punitive measures deferred pending aggregate review. Deferred, not forgiven. The interrogations continued until every worker in the chamber had confessed to something: inaction, ignorance, fatigue, doubt. Guilt was distributed evenly, efficiently. When it was done, the auditors withdrew to confer, their helms close together, voices too low to hear. We stood in silence, sweat cooling on our skin, the red light still glaring overhead. Finally, the lead auditor turned back to us. Corrective action enacted, he announced. Personnel reduction authorized. Output quotas adjusted to compensate. 2 enforcers moved down the line, stopping at seemingly random intervals. Each time they stopped, a worker was seized and removed through one of the side hatches. No explanations were given, no appeals were heard. The selection felt arbitrary, but I knew better. It was calculated, based on metrics I would never see. I was spared. That fact weighed on me heavier than the loss of those who were taken. When the auditors left, the alarms ceased. The lumen strips returned to their usual sickly white. The vats restarted with a shudder, resuming their endless churn, as if nothing had happened. The overseers ordered us back to work immediately. Downtime is heresy. One reminded us, redemption is productivity. The chamber felt emptier with fewer bodies moving through it. The absence was visible, measurable. Stations stood unmanned, their gauges blinking patiently. By the end of the cycle, replacement workers arrived, new allocations with fresh seals, eyes wide and unfocused. They took up positions without ceremony, stepping into the gaps left behind. At the end of shift, a notice was posted on the board outside the dormitory. Output quotas had been raised, efficiency expectations recalculated. The contamination event was summarized in 3 terse bullet points, stripped of fear and blood and silence. I read it twice, my augmetic hand leaving faint smears on the parchment. That night, sleep did not come easily. When it did, it was shallow and broken, filled with dreams of red lights and sealed doors, of side hatches opening onto endless dark. I woke with my heart pounding, the phantom sensation of being dragged away lingering in my limbs. In the bunk across from mine, one of the new workers muttered prayers in his sleep, his voice cracking with terror. I lay there listening, counting breaths, knowing with a grim certainty that survival had nothing to do with innocence. It was about being useful at the right moment, about standing just far enough from disaster that someone else was closer. The contamination had passed, but its lesson lingered like a stain no amount of scrubbing could remove. We had been weighed, found wanting, and adjusted accordingly. The ledger balanced. The process continued, and I remained, marked, complicit, and acutely aware that next time, the side hatch might open for me. The extra ration came without announcement, slipped onto my tray as if it were an accounting error rather than a reward. I noticed it immediately, an additional slab of starch, slightly darker in color, its surface smoother, less cracked than the standard issue. A small parchment strip was pressed into its wax wrapping, stamped with a sigil of approval. Exemplary recovery output, it read. Service recognized. My stomach clenched. Around me, others ate in silence, their movements mechanical, eyes downcast. No one commented on the additional portion, though I felt their awareness like pressure on my skin. Extra rations were rare. They marked you, not for praise. Attention was dangerous. Still, protocol demanded consumption. Waste, even of reward, was heresy. I sat on my bunk and unwrapped the slab. The smell was faint but distinct, richer than usual, with a greasy undertone that made my mouth water despite myself. Hunger had a way of overriding thought. I took a bite. It was softer than the standard issue, easier to chew. The texture reminded me unpleasantly of something between meat and paste. I swallowed, forcing myself not to gag, not to imagine too clearly what made this batch different. The sermons piped through the dormitory speakers chose that moment to swell in volume, the vox caster crackling with fervor. Be grateful. The voice intoned. For the Emperor provides. In your flesh you sustain the many. In the many your flesh endures. I chewed more slowly after that, each mouthful turning heavy in my gut. The truth was not new. I had always known, in the abstract, what we produced and why, but knowing and tasting were different things. The realization settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was eating the end result of my own labor, the rendered remains of those I had fed into the grinders, boiled and stabilized and redistributed. Perhaps even someone I had known. Perhaps one day myself. My augmetic hand twitched, metal prongs scraping softly against the tray. I finished the ration anyway. Hunger demanded it. Doctrine required it. When I licked the residue from my fingers, the act felt obscene, but I did it all the same. The next cycle, the extra ration appeared again. And the next. Each time, the parchment bore the same phrase, the same sigil. My output had improved since the contamination event, fewer hesitations, smoother handling, better adaptation to the augmetic. The overseers noted it with approval, their data slates chiming softly as metrics updated. I was becoming efficient in ways that mattered. The sermons grew more insistent as well, their timing no coincidence. They spoke of sacrifice as the purest expression of love, of how the Imperium endured only because its citizens fed one another in body and spirit. To consume is to commune. The preacher declared, voice thick with static, "You are closer to the Emperor with every bite." I tried to pray along, but my words felt hollow. Instead, images intruded, flashes of the line, the vats, the side hatches swallowing workers whole. I wondered whose flesh I was chewing. A guardsman fallen in some distant war. A laborer who slipped on the floor and didn't get up. Someone like me, marked and processed when their output declined. The thought should have horrified me. Instead, it filled me with a dull, spreading resignation. My body changed under the new rations. Strength returned to muscles I thought permanently exhausted. The infection around my augmetic stump receded slightly, the swelling less angry. The medici noted the improvement during a routine scan, nodding once. "Nutrient intake adequate," he said. "Continue current allotment." Adequate. The word echoed in my head. I was adequate because others had ceased to be. On the vat floor, I began to work longer shifts without complaint. When others faltered, I compensated instinctively, stepping into gaps, taking on additional tasks. The overseers noticed. Once, one of them even placed a hand on my shoulder, brief, heavy, impersonal. "Good recovery," he said. "Your service honors the process." The touch made my skin crawl. At night, I dreamed of eating endlessly, my mouth full but never satisfied. I dreamed of the grinders reversing, of paste flowing backward into recognizable shapes, faces forming briefly before dissolving again. I woke with my jaw clenched, my teeth aching as if I had been chewing stone. One evening as I sat finishing my ration, a newer worker across from me hesitated over his food. He was thin, eyes too bright, hands shaking as he stared at the slab. I recognized the look, recognition dawning too late. "It's blessed," I heard myself say quietly. The words surprised me as much as they did him. "Eat, you'll need the strength." He looked at me, searching my face for something, comfort, perhaps, or absolution. I gave him neither. He ate. The realization struck me afterward, sharp and cold. I had become part of the system's voice. I was repeating its justifications, smoothing its edges for those newer, weaker. The sermons no longer needed to convince me. I was doing their work for them. As the cycles passed, I began to measure time by rations rather than sirens. Each extra slab marked another day survived, another confirmation of usefulness. And beneath that accounting ran a quieter question, one I never voiced aloud, but felt growing heavier with each bite. How long before my flesh was deemed nutritious enough to feed someone else? The answer came not as fear, but as a strange, wary curiosity. When I looked at the vats now, at the thick steam rising from them, I did not imagine falling in by accident. I imagined the paperwork, the recalculations, the neat efficiency of it all. The sermons called this acceptance enlightenment. I wasn't sure what to call it. I only knew that the starch sat heavy in my stomach, and that for the first time since my induction, I was no longer certain whether I was sustaining the Imperium or simply being prepared for it. Decline is not announced. It is not marked by sirens or seals or the sudden arrival of auditors. It is quieter than that, recorded in marginal notes, in fractional drops on a data slate graph, in the way an overseer's gaze lingers half a second longer than it used to. By the time I understood what was happening to me, the decision had already been made. I was simply waiting for it to be executed. The infection in my stump returned first, creeping back despite the improved rations. The flesh around the augmetic connection darkened, tender and swollen, weeping again beneath the metal collar. I adjusted my wraps tighter, ignoring the heat and the smell. Reporting it felt pointless. The medici would note it, calculate its impact, and nothing more. Pain that did not immediately halt output was not pain worth addressing. Then the augmetic began to misfire. It started as a stutter, a delayed response when I flexed the clamp, a fraction of a second where the prongs failed to close. On the vat floor, fractions mattered. I compensated instinctively, adjusting my stance, relying more heavily on my remaining hand. My movements grew less efficient, though I told myself no one noticed. They noticed. The first correction came as a warning rune on my personal notice slate: productivity variance detected. Monitor performance. The second was a reduction in my rest interval, justified as an opportunity to rebuild functional consistency. I accepted both without comment. Acceptance had become reflex, but the numbers kept sliding. My output dipped below the recalculated average. Not catastrophically, never enough to cause immediate concern, but enough to mark a trend. Trends were dangerous. Trends suggested inevitability. I felt it in my body as well. Fatigue settled into my bones, deeper than before, a weariness that no ration could fully dispel. My dreams grew heavier, filled not with motion but with stillness, endless ledgers stretching into the dark, my designation repeating line after line, until it blurred into static. I woke each cycle more slowly, joints stiff, mind lagging behind command. One shift, my augmetic hand locked mid-task, prongs frozen open. The hose it was meant to steady jerked, spraying hot condensate across the floor. I reacted quickly enough to prevent a spill, but the delay was logged. The overseer's gaze flicked to me, then to his data slate. He said nothing, but his silence was worse than a reprimand. At the end of that cycle, a clerk waited outside the dormitory block with a slate bearing my designation. Lind, of service review pending, he said, voice neutral. Report to administrative annex at start of next rest interval. I nodded. I did not ask questions. Questions had never altered outcomes here. The administrative annex was colder than the medical wing, its air dry and lifeless. The walls were bare metal, polished to a dull sheen, reflecting distorted versions of those who passed through. I sat on a bench bolted to the floor, my hands folded in my lap, one flesh, one metal, while a clerk reviewed my file. He did not look at me as he spoke. Cumulative efficiency decline confirmed, he said. Augmetic instability noted. Infection recurrence logged. Projected recovery cost exceeds replacement value. Replacement value. The phrase settled over me with an unexpected gentleness. Not cruel, not angry, simply final. End of service processing approved. The clerk continued. You are to conclude current duties. Preparatory interval granted for asset reconciliation. Asset reconciliation. I understood then what this meeting was not. It was not a sentencing. That had happened long ago. This was accounting. I was given a slate listing my remaining obligations, surrender of personal effects, sanitation of assigned station, transfer of tools, final confession filing. There was even a line item for emotional stabilization, which consisted of a brief prayer session scheduled before processing. Everything was tidy. Everything balanced. When I returned to the vat floor, the space felt different, not because anything had changed, but because I had. I saw my station not as a place of labor, but as something already past. The gauges blinked patiently. The vats churned as they always had. The work continued without acknowledging my impending absence. I scrubbed my station meticulously as instructed. Every surface polished, every hose aligned. I cleaned residue from corners no one usually bothered with, my movements slow and deliberate. This was the last thing I would do here, and the irony was not lost on me. My final contribution was to make the place ready for someone else. Coworkers noticed, eventually. One asked, quietly, why I was taking so long. I showed him the slate. He nodded once, expression carefully blank. Good yield, he said after a pause. It was the closest thing to a farewell I had ever received. In the dormitory, I packed my effects, few enough that it took little time. The token strip, the extra wraps for my stump, the worn copy of the labor catechism issued at induction. I signed each item away, my designation stamped and confirmed. Ownership dissolved into process. The confession filing was conducted in a small booth lined with acoustic dampeners. A picked eye stared at me from the wall unblinking. I recited the required phrases, acknowledging inefficiency, expressing gratitude for the opportunity to serve, affirming the justice of the Imperium's calculus. My voice was steady. I surprised myself with that. As I spoke, a strange calm settled over me. The constant tension, the effort to keep up, to remain useful, to stay just ahead of notice, fell away. There was nothing left to prove. My value had been assessed. The verdict rendered. That night, for the first time in countless cycles, I slept without dreams. No grinders, no ledgers, just darkness deep and complete. When the wake siren sounded, it felt distant, almost irrelevant. I rose, dressed, and waited. Enforcers arrived precisely on schedule, their movements practiced and impersonal. They did not restrain me. There was no need. As we walked the familiar corridors, I noticed details I had long since stopped seeing, the worn inscriptions on the walls, the chipped paint around shrine alcoves, the faint echo of prayers absorbed into the metal. I wondered how many others had walked this path before me, how many would follow. At the processing antechamber, the enforcers paused. One handed me a final slate. "Acknowledge completion," he said. I pressed my thumb to the reader. The slate chimed softly. The ledger closed. There was no fear then. Only a hollow acceptance, as if I had been holding my breath since induction and was finally allowed to exhale. Whatever came next would be efficient, purposeful, counted, and in this place, that was the closest thing to peace I had ever known. They marched me at shift change. When the corridors were loudest and most crowded, when the movement of bodies made any single one of us insignificant. 2 enforcers walked behind me, their boots striking the deck in perfect cadence. I was not bound. I did not resist. Resistance would have required belief in an alternative, and I had none left. The path was familiar. That was the cruelty of it. We passed the wash holes where I had scrubbed my skin raw in pursuit of purity. We passed the chapel where I had knelt and begged not for salvation, but for numbness. We passed the intake ramps, the heavy doors stamped with mottos I could now recite from memory. Waste is heresy. Compliance is life. The words felt less like warnings now and more like gentle explanations. Workers stepped aside as we moved through, eyes averted. Some recognized the destination, even if they pretended not to. No one spoke. Silence was the final courtesy. The grinders awaited me in a chamber set apart from the main floor, reserved for internal processing. They were cleaner than the ones I had worked beside, polished, freshly sanctified, their housings adorned with new purity seals that crackled faintly with static energy. Incense burned in metal braziers at the corners of the room, its smoke thick and sweet, barely masking the familiar underlying stench. The air vibrated with restrained power, the machines idling, patient. A robed officiant stood near the control lectern, his face hidden behind a mask of hammered steel. He held a data slate in one hand and a sensor in the other, swinging it gently as he chanted. The words washed over me, familiar phrases rearranged into a final liturgy. Yield is honor, he intoned. Completion is devotion. The body ends, the service continues. I was positioned at the edge of the platform, toes inches from the chute's lip. Below, darkness waited, broken only by the faint glint of steel far beneath. I could hear the grinders' teeth shifting, aligning, eager in their mechanical way. The sound was almost comforting. I had listened to it for so long that silence would have felt wrong. The officiant approached and gestured for me to kneel. I did. The metal was cold against my knees. He pressed the slate into my flesh hand. Final acknowledgement, he said. I read it once, then again. It summarized my existence here in numbers and brief annotations. Cycles served, output contributed, losses sustained, final yield projected. My designation appeared at the top and bottom, stamped and countersigned. There was a space for a thumbprint. My thumb hovered for a moment. Not in doubt. Doubt had been burned out of me, but in reflection. I thought of the clerk who had crossed out my name. I thought of the first body I had dragged from the belt. I thought of the extra ration, soft and warm in my mouth. None of it felt like mine anymore. It all belonged to the process. I pressed my thumb down. The slate chimed softly. Somewhere a ledger updated. The officiant nodded and stepped back. Proceed, he said, voice reverent. The enforcers guided me forward. The platform vibrated as the grinder powered up, its roar swelling to fill the chamber. The sound was immense, overwhelming, but I welcomed it. It drowned out thought, drowned out memory. I opened my mouth and recited the catechisms as instructed, my voice thin and fragile against the machine's thunder. I give what remains. I am counted. I am complete. As the edge of the chute pressed against my shins, a final understanding settled over me, not revelation, not horror, but clarity. My life had never been measured in years or moments or relationships. It had been measured in output, in acceptable variance, in how much of me could be converted into something useful. This was not a failure. It was fulfillment. The enforcers released me. For an instant, there was weightlessness. Then gravity took hold and I fell. The roar became all-encompassing, a wall of sound that erased everything else. The air tore past me, hot and foul. I saw flashes of steel, the blur of teeth spinning into alignment. Pain registered only briefly, a distant, abstract concept. Before sensation shattered completely, there was no scream left in me. There was no room for it. In that final fraction of a second, before consciousness unraveled, I felt something like peace. Not hope, not joy. Peace, as defined here, the certainty that nothing more would be demanded of me. I had met the quota. I had balanced the ledger. The Imperium would endure. It always did. It would endure on the strength of countless bodies like mine, rendered and redistributed, forgotten as individuals but invaluable as mass. Somewhere above, rations would be issued, workers would eat, sermons would praise sacrifice, and my flesh ground, boiled, sanctified, would pass from hand to mouth to muscle, sustaining a system that had never known my name. The grinder roared on, indifferent and eternal. The ledger was balanced, the yield was complete.